Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's discussion on business of climate action. Today's discussion marks the last in our webinar series, Global Climate Action and Your Bottom Line. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Karen Tamwu, the Regional Director for the Pembina Institute in BC and co-founder and co-chair of the Catalyst Business Alliance. To start, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining you from the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. We're grateful for their stewardship of the lands and water since time immemorial. Catalyst Business Alliance and the Pembina Institute are pleased to present today's event in collaboration with the British Consulate-General and the Vancouver Economic Commission. The Catalyst Business Alliance is a network of Canadian companies working together to champion strong climate and energy policy and the creation of a resilient economy. For those of you who don't know the Pembina Institute, we're Canada's leading climate and energy policy think tank. We work together with governments, industries, and communities to advance a prosperous, clean energy future for Canada. On behalf of the Pembina Institute, I'd also like to thank the Real Estate Foundation of BC, the Sitka Foundation, and the North Family Foundation for their generous support of our work. If you'd like to support our work in this important area, please get in touch with us at pembina.org. Some housekeeping items for today's event. All participants will be muted during the webinar. This broadcast is being recorded and will be available on Pembina's website at pembina.org. Before we get to the speakers, I'd like to check in with all of you who are joining us today and see how prepared you and your company feel about financial disclosure. So if climate-related financial disclosure was required tomorrow, how ready would you or your company be? We'll just take a minute or so to get audience votes. All right, let's check in on how the results play out. Looks like we're going to need some training. No surprise. Well, today is a good start for that. I'd like to introduce you to the moderator for today's discussion, George Benson. George is the Manager of Economic Transition at the Vancouver Economic Commission. He leads the Commission's work on decarbonization and the just transition, as well as climate finance. Over to you, George.
Thank you so much, Karen. It's such a pleasure to be here with everyone today. I want to also acknowledge that I'm joining you all from the unceded and traditional territories of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh, and what's now known as Vancouver. I'm grateful to their stewardship of these lands as well as we look to have this important conversation today. This is a really exciting conversation, and for those of you who've been a part of some of the other ones that the Pembina Institute, VEC, and the Consul-General have had the pleasure of running over the past few months. I think it's in some ways it's one of the more challenging ones to enter, and we thought a lot about this as we queued this up and prepared the panelists that we're going to have speaking to you today. We wanted this to be a conversation that people could relate to, because on the one hand, I think it's clear from, if you listen to people like Mark Carney and many of the other senior leaders around the world, we know that climate finance is absolutely mission critical to achieving our climate objectives. We know that at a local level, the City of Vancouver declaring its Climate Emergency Action Plan, we know that various forms of finance are going to be critical to that. We know that it's crucial for climate justice because of the challenges and inequities in the Global South and the relative amount of emissions that we in wealthy countries like Canada have emitted relative to those in the Global South where impacts will be felt most strongly. And we know that it's critical at the global level across the entirety of the world to ensure that we have the infrastructure and the services in place that are going to mean that we can both adapt to and mitigate climate change. That said, climate finance is a difficult topic. We're talking about international flows of capital, we're talking about supply chains, we're talking about various financial instruments that many of us, myself included, are not always familiar with. And so we wanted to ask the question, what would be the most accessible way we could start this conversation? And we do think this will be a start to one. And so as we reflected, we felt that supply chains and risk mitigation were really two of the crucial ways we could tie these together. risk mitigation, because we know many of you in the small business community are facing a variety of challenges, whether that's related to recovery from COVID-19 or just the plethora of standards and reporting and policy announcements and so on that are happening. We wanted to provide a sense of, if you're worried about this, here's how you could start to address it. And then on the other hand, from the supply chain side, we thought that many of you either are already facing reporting and disclosure from either the people you sell to or the people you buy from, and that you may be worried about that or wanting to do that as part of your competitive positioning in the future, if you are looking to be a robust supplier within different procurement processes. So we came up with this panel's concept of supply chains and risk management, and we've brought in, I think, two incredibly exciting speakers to frame that up for us. I'm not going to give you all of their really long, very, very impressive bios, but we have Kevin Quinlan here from Manifest Climate, who's a climate strategist there, and we have Andrew Cummings from CDP, who's the Associate Director of Sustainable Supply Chains. These two folks are incredibly knowledgeable about this space, and I think they're going to have a lot of really interesting things to say to tie this together. So we're going to start with Andrew, who's going to sort of cue us up for the supply chain aspect of this conversation, and then Kevin is going to come in to, I think, operationalize a little bit more of this, particularly in the context of TCFD. So with that said, I'm going to turn it directly over to Andrew here to get us started. And once we've heard from both our speakers, we'll go into a Q&A that I think will be a lot of fun. So Andrew, over to you.
Thank you, George, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak with this group today. As George mentioned, my name is Andrew Cummings. I'm the Associate Director for the Sustainable Supply Chain Program with CDP North America, calling in from Manhattan, and certainly give thanks and tribute to the Lenape people, who are the original stewards of this island. So moving on to the next slide, just running through our agenda, I'll cover three pretty big topics, but certainly some nuts and bolts in there. One, why disclose your environmental impacts? Two, how to get started, which certainly hopefully aligns with that 90% that needs some more training. And then three, rounded off with some really important concepts that you all should be aware of as you progress in your environmental disclosure journey, and some tools. So first off, going really broadly, who is CDP? We are an international nonprofit organization that runs a disclosure system through which companies, cities, states, and regions provide environmental impact information in a standardized way that allows our key stakeholder groups to really make informed decisions, either for investments, for purchases, or for policy. So moving on to the next slide, you can see how this disclosure model works in practice. Once again, we work on behalf of and along with major stakeholder groups, two of them being the investor community and supply chain members. The investor community, it's easy to think about these large asset owners or asset managers as the BlackRocks of the world, or Vanguards, or state pension funds. For instance, New York State's Teacher Retirement Pension Fund is one of our institutional investors, and they make a strategic request of companies that they invest in to understand their future environmental impacts as it relates to climate change or water or commodities linked to deforestation. The other group that we really work closely with, and my team in particular, are the supply chain members. And so these are large purchasing organizations or governments who use that buying lever to start a conversation about the environmental impacts of their strategic suppliers. And very similar to the institutional investors, they really want to understand the risks behind their purchasing, the impacts, and how they can influence positive change through that business relationship. So moving to the next slide, you can see some of these supply chain members. Folks on the call might recognize them. It could be some buyers that you operate with. It could be some sellers. But these members represent over 5 trillion in purchasing power that really leverages that buying relationship to move the needle on environmental disclosure. I briefly touched on three main areas that we really focus on from the supply chain side: risks, impacts, and influence. And I'll take you through each of those in the next couple slides. The first one, risks. Climate risk is pretty apparent. We see it with and certainly in the United States, with hurricanes becoming much more intense in terms of the precipitation or the wind that they deliver, or droughts. Similar in Canada with temperatures increasing, and we have permafrost melts, things like that, wildfires, etc. So this report, I always like to highlight, it came out a couple years ago on the United States Thanksgiving. It was kind of buried by the previous administration, but folks got to it. And the New York Times summarized a really key segment. It's virtually certain to increasingly affect U.S. trade and the economy, overseas operations, and supply chains as the climate warms, the climate becomes more unstable. And so as a buyer, our buyers are really interested in understanding this climate risk that's inherent into their value chain, especially global operations. And this applies for both manufacturers of widgets, but also service sector industries, whether or not you can perform the services that you were contracted for. All of that is tied into climate risk. Next slide talks about impact. And so here, again, supply chain members and buying organizations have significant impact in the things that they procure. This slide represents Scope 3 emissions, so the emissions from your indirect purchases. Scope 1 emissions are from your direct operational emissions, Scope 2 being the emissions associated with energy consumption. And then Scope 3 is everything else. So that could be not only the widgets that you need to create your product, it can be the payroll provider that you outsource to run your payroll operations, et cetera, et cetera. And so all of those indirect emissions oftentimes is the largest impact that these buying organizations have. And so by engaging your supply chain, you're able to start to understand this impact and influence the impact, which brings us to the next and final slide for this little bundle here. And resilient suppliers make better business partners. And so by influencing your supply chain, you are driving resiliency into your value chain. And this is a key message that we often communicate to our supply chain members. Going through this process helps them become better business partners. And so you, as a company who might be looking to disclose environmental information for the first time, you're able to make this narrative, make this case, and really establish your own path forward and communicate to your organizations that you work with, hey, we are resilient, we are looking forward into the future, and we're really taking this climate risk seriously. The final slide in this section kind of puts some numbers behind this. And we, climate risk, it could be a little bit nebulous, but certainly these numbers carry some significant weight. We're talking 1.26 trillion in associated environmental risks, as reported through the CDP disclosure platform last year. So this is something that in the next 5 years, companies are really aware of. And these environmental risks, again, could be tagged to climate risks specifically or water insecurity. And so we certainly want to be aware of drought-prone areas getting even more dry, or areas becoming much more wet from increased rainfall, but also deforestation. You might lose your license to operate if you are not functioning in the legal system that's for that region, things like this. So there's significant financial risk behind the climate risk. And so by going through the disclosure process, if you need a reason to get started, it's understanding that financial risk and then working to mitigate it. There's also some significant opportunities by going through this process, and we can touch on that later on in this presentation. So we're here to learn a couple quick tips to help you get started in that journey. First off, if you're looking at CDP as the mechanism to communicate your environmental impact information, we certainly appreciate your disclosure. We are one of the most well-known names on the block. We've been doing this for quite some time, but all of our information is also publicly available, which is really helpful if you're just getting started, because you can use the CDP questionnaires as a tool to really help map out your own environmental journey. I think one thing that companies often sort of trip over themselves when they're first getting started is they feel that they have to do all of it all at once. And I would say break it down into what is manageable and achievable in steps 1, 2, and 3, but also have some of those medium and long-term goals, such as implement this, some climate resiliency on the board level, or set science-based targets, for instance, et cetera, et cetera. But use the questionnaires as a way to really build out your own internal operations if you're doing this for the first time. The next slide sort of breaks down our climate change questionnaire specifically. So we operate both climate change, but also water and forest. This call is dedicated to climate risk, so let's review it real quick. The CDP questionnaire, again, using it as a tool to understand where you are, where you need to go. We have qualitative sections, we got quantitative sections, and then a supply chain section that is specific to that buyer-seller relationship. The qualitative information, you might already be able to fill out some things. Your board might meet and discuss climate-related initiatives. You might have internal teams looking at sustainability performance. You might already be drafting some business continuity plans that include some climate resiliency in there. All of those things you can communicate in a qualitative manner in the climate change questionnaire. Similarly, if you got some numbers behind that, about your own greenhouse gas emissions, how much energy your organization consumes, or some emission reduction activities, you're already well on your way to providing this information. The supply chain module sort of comes later. If you get a request from a customer that we work with, you might have a couple of different questions, but I would say if you're just getting started, really focus on those qualitative and quantitative sections. And then build yourself a roadmap. So the final slide here really lays out kind of the environmental best practice journey. And I hyperlinked at the bottom of the slide a guide for environmental action. You can also find this guide freely available on CDP's website, and it really maps out a solid step-by-step journey for folks who are just getting started, or maybe you have started your environmental journey, but you're trying to get better at it, what to do next, all the way on track to really the leadership level of environmental excellence with board level oversight, thoroughly set climate targets, TCFD, which Kevin certainly will go into, things like that. So use these tools that I identify to really help you get started. Again, just start somewhere. You don't have to have all of the answers, and the companies that we work with too don't expect first-time disclosures to have all of the answers. They would much rather see a partial set of answers than no responses at all. So certainly just get started. The final little chunk for my bit is some helpful concepts and some resources. So the next slide addresses TCFD, which stands for the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. Certainly a mouthful, so the acronym is super helpful in this one, TCFD. Kevin will go into this much more robustly, but what TCFD does is try to articulate specific climate-related things that an organization needs to communicate in a financially oriented way. And so the CDP questionnaire is fully aligned to the TCFD recommendations. And so by going through the CDP questionnaire and establishing your own roadmap internally, you are also aligning your organization to TCFD. Financial reporting like this, climate-related financial reporting, I should say, is rapidly becoming sort of the business norm. Certainly, the U.S. Securities Exchange Commission is looking to have a TCFD-like statement in 10K filings or another sort of public document, things like that. The European Union is actively looking at this. So TCFD is definitely a concept that you should be aware of, whether or not you are a public traded company. It will help your organization align to climate risk, mitigate those risks, and help future-proof your growth long term. That's one big concept. The second concept on the next slide to be aware of are science-based targets. And so science-based targets, if we can transition to the next slide, is targets that are aligned with what climate science tells us we need to do to keep global temperatures in line with a 1.5 degrees C scenario. So what science-based targets are is they look at the sector that your organization is in, and it says, based on the sector that you're in, here's how much we need to decarbonize from that sector, and here's how and in what time frame. And then you as an organization, you can take the steps to understand which activities you need to do to be in line with that 1.5 degree pathway in order to help the global community, again, stay within that 1.5 degree boundaries. The SBTI, which is the Science-Based Target initiative has created really robust methodologies to help companies of all shapes and sizes understand what their carbon footprint, what they need to do to decrease their carbon footprint, I should say. So if you are a large company, there's a pathway for you. If you are a small company, there's also a pathway for you. And so you can see some of the high level numbers on the screen where we have actually over 2,000 companies now taking action. Almost 1,000 with actual science-based targets. So the first step is just committing to have a target. The second step is getting a valid target approved. We have nearly 1,000 companies who've committed to that 1.5 degree business pathway. And that again is saying we are going to do our part to keep global temperatures under 1.5 degrees. And then we have nearly 200 companies who are small, who set targets. So again, a really important concept to keep in mind as you are going through this disclosure journey. But if you're just starting, both TCFD and SBTs might be step 2 or step 3, and that is okay, but you should be aware that that is part of your journey, I would say. The final slide is a bunch of resources and tools for you to use. Just kind of quickly going through it. There are some environmental guides to help you set up your own journey. There are some training materials such as the GHG training by Microsoft, which is free and very, very helpful if you want to really nerd out on scope 1 emissions and scope 2 emissions and what scope 3 emissions are. If you want to get some more information about TCFD, along with Kevin's brilliant presentation, which we'll hear next, the TCFD Knowledge Hub is a great source for all of your information. And if you're a smaller organization, there is an SME Climate Hub, which is a great platform to help you understand climate action and some tools to help SMEs really decrease your own emissions. So with that concludes my segment of the presentation. I really appreciate the opportunity. And when we get to the Q&A, happy to take all and any questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Andrew. That was brilliant. Lots of very actionable stuff, I think, for folks in there, and love that resource list. I'll just want to highlight, if you haven't seen it in the chat already, Karen from Pembina was just noting, we'd love to start to queue up questions. So if anything from Andrew's presentation got you curious or you want to know more, then please feel free to throw some questions in there already. I'll be getting those all queued up for once we're done with Kevin. So I'm going to turn over to Kevin now to dive into the next portion.
Great, thanks so much, George, and thanks everyone for joining today. And special thanks, Andrew, for teeing everything up. Really want to give kudos to CDP for really, moving the needle on climate disclosure in the corporate world. They've definitely been at it for a long time, and great to be part of the conversation today. Building on sort of some of the stuff we've already heard, I'm going to touch a little bit around the TCFD piece that Andrew mentioned. Because you're probably going to hear about it a lot. You may be reading about it, wondering what does it mean? What is it relevant for me? What does it mean in Canada? So I'm going to sort of touch on some of those things and some of the forces behind what's driving it. So if you go to the next slide, I wanted to frame up just at a high level how I'm just going to be quickly approaching this. So one, going a little bit more into what the TCFD is. I'll spend a little bit of time on what's really driving the demand for climate disclosure. What are the forces that businesses are facing, organizations are facing to produce disclosures around climate. And then I'm going to close out by sharing some key considerations. Spoiler alert, although in a good way, they very much align with what Andrew just showed. So it's good to know we're all on the same page on that. And I'll be taking a little bit of a slightly different tack on some ways to be thinking about how you could go about TCFD. So on the next slide, I like to sort of kick things off with a bit of a visual around how we approach TCFD, and on the next slide really sort of outlines how the components of TCFD fit together. And so this can kind of be a helpful way just to frame it up visually. So you've got the TCFD, and within it there are 4 pillars of different categories: governance, risk management, strategy, and metrics and targets. Across those 4 pillars are 11 recommendations for what companies should disclose. And then TCFD also provides guidance for specific sectors for additional types of ways to report on climate and what those can be. So we go to the next slide. A little bit more detail around the TCFD, and again, a key component of thinking of this is that they all fit together. They're not siloed. TCFD is really meant to help organizations get at the fundamental question of what does climate change mean for my business? How is my business going to change? And really looking at all of the different components that go into it. Just taking a step back, when we think about TCFD, well, where did it come from? Andrew mentioned and spelling it out is from a task force. The task force put forward recommendations in 2017. The task force was chaired by Mike Bloomberg and had reps from a number of major financial sector organizations, banks, investors, consulting firms. The goal was really to provide some sort of standardized framework so that when businesses put forward disclosures on climate change, they were providing decision useful information. If you operate in the sort of the ESG climate space, there are lots of different types of reports and things out there. And companies can have all sorts of different things they report on. So TCFD was really meant to sort of put a bit of a fence around that and say, look, these are really the most important things we want to see. If you go to the next slide. An important thing to keep in mind with TCFD when we think about, well, why is it relevant? There's a lot of different frameworks out there. Oh, yeah, stay on that one there. Why is it relevant, from a business standpoint? And really one of the key components is that it connects finance and climate with business decisions. Again, what is this decision useful information that is relevant for investors and businesses? So it connects the dots to the different pieces, the income statement, the cash flow statement, the balance sheet, really to sort of get into the nitty gritty of it. And on the next slide, one of the things we always like to highlight is that it's looking at, the one before that, please. It's looking at the issue of risks. And Andrew touched a bit on the different types of climate risks. And TCFD is really meant to help companies unpack the difference and making sure they're keep taking track of transition risks and physical risks. Because often businesses only kind of focus on maybe on one area. And there's different ways to think about climate risk. It's not just the big physical events. It can be things like new potential policies in response to climate, reputational impacts that could happen to businesses that aren't seen as being climate leaders. So there's a lot of different ways to think about that. And TCFD is really helpful for making sure that your business is really thinking through, maybe some things around climate that you hadn't really traditionally thought about. And on the next slide, we always like to highlight, a key component of TCFD is that it's also about opportunities. It's not just all the risk component. It's thinking about how does my business aim to take advantage of and capitalize the opportunities that exist as the world shifts to decarbonize, to move off of fossil fuels, to increase low carbon solutions. And how does my business fit into that? And so at a high level, TCFD is really giving you a framework as an organization to articulate that, to basically say, what is your climate story? Next slide. And so when we think about, what is your climate story, it's helpful to sort of think about it as a way of looking at what's your climate maturity, thinking about different questions around, what is your organization doing, but how does climate integrate into how your business functions? And going through the process of TCFD and doing that type of disclosure, asking the questions that TCFD puts forward is really useful for doing that. And Andrew touched on this a little bit, but I wanted to expand on it, which is that, even if you're not going to do some sort of public disclosure around climate, simply going through the process of taking the TCFD and applying that lens to your business is extremely useful. And particularly if you're in the position where you feel you're sort of at the start of your climate journey, you're not really, you want to do the right thing, you don't really know where to begin, maybe you've never had questions about climate put to your business and all of a sudden you're getting them. TCFD is a really good way to start that conversation and to make sure that you're asking the right questions around that. Next slide. It's also important to remember that TCFD, it's more than just a checklist. It's really about thinking deeply around climate as it relates to your business. And one of the goals with TCFD is to help break down those internal silos. So one thing we see is very common in organizations, small and large, is that climate is kind of siloed off somewhere. It's the sustainability department's responsibility, or it's the ESG person, or what have you. TCFD is really a way to connect the dots across the organization, because what does climate mean for your chief risk officer? What does it mean for the CFO? What does it mean for operations? Climate impacts those things in different ways, and you need to be thinking about that to really fully understand the impact, potential impact of climate risks, physical and transition, but also the opportunities. So again, TCFD is not just a checklist you go through and sort of, am I doing this, yes or no? It's a qualitative framework. So it's meant to guide you on the types of questions you should be asking. Next slide. This also builds on something Andrew said, and very, very similar slide. We have the curve going up and to the right, which is really to emphasize that the TCFD reporting process, it's a journey. It's not a one and done thing, and it's not the type of thing that in year one you're going to have everything solved and everything figured out. TCFD is meant to build and enhance climate capacity, climate capability over time. So it's really important to be thinking about it that way. And I totally agree with Andrew that it's far better to get started, even if you don't have everything, than to not get started at all. That's really the key thing we urge, is start that process of this. Don't feel that you have to have everything all ready and fully baked when you do sort of a first report or disclosure in alignment with TCFD, because that's not expected. It's going to take time to do that, and TCFD itself recognizes that. Next slide. So in this section, I'll quickly go through, what are some of the drivers around this, and where are we seeing that demand for climate disclosure come from? On the next slide, you'll see, how we kind of stack this up is, again, we know there's an urgent need for action, and the government plans and goals are not in place yet to get us to 1.5 degrees, to limit warming to that. And so there's that question around, what is the role of the private sector? And there's a real mobilization we're seeing. It's not enough yet. There's much more to do, but there's a lot happening. And there are ripple effects through a number of the commitments and announcements we're seeing that play out to why your business should be thinking about TCFD and why it's relevant to you. Next slide. So just quickly around some of this, two key things to keep in mind with TCFD. One is, you may have heard there's a lot of other reporting frameworks out there, including CDP, that have a lot of uptake. A lot of people use them. And sometimes we hear complaints. People say, oh, there's too many reporting frameworks. Which one should I be using? What's relevant? And different ones are, relevant potentially in different industries. But TCFD is very much, being brought into alignment with a number of the other ones there. So, for example, PRI includes a component around TCFD. GRES, which is for real estate, includes a component around TCFD. So you're seeing it feed in to other reporting frameworks. The other big piece is, not yet. Going back, on the investors one there on the side, there's a number of investor initiatives that are focusing on pushing and advocating to the clients they invest in to be more aggressive on climate. And a big part of that consistently is demanding that they do TCFD aligned disclosures. So Climate Action 100 Plus is one of the best known ones. It targets globally some of the biggest emitters around the world. Just in the past week, there was the launch of Climate Engagement Canada, a great initiative that is looking at targeting some of the most significant emitters publicly traded in Canada. And so that's Canadian asset managers focusing their engagement on really driving and advocating to companies to take significant steps to reduce emissions. And part of that includes an expectation that they are doing TCFD aligned reporting. Next slide. Now, you saw earlier in Andrew's presentation, I talked about the scope 1, 2, and 3, and you can probably do it in a much better way than I can. But the reason I put this in here is that the connection between your business and what you may think about, what are these other these big companies, why does it matter, or why should I care if one of Canada's big banks has committed to net zero by 2050. Why does that matter? Why does it matter if, you know, a lot of these other companies, whether, you know, Google or Microsoft or whoever, why do they do that? What does that mean for me? Well, the key thing to remember when we talk about the emissions is that, you know, it is all connected. And the scope 3 piece is, you know, a really critical one to think of. Because historically, we just focus so much on, you know, really scope 1 and 2. What is the stuff directly within your control? And scope 3 really opens up that conversation to be thinking about, you know, what are all the impacts and things that you are having as a business through the life cycle of your product. So for example, there's been a real shift in the last year or two around banks calculating and accounting for their scope 3 emissions, so that all of a sudden now, if a bank is financing, you know, an oil and gas project or a coal facility, effectively those emissions of those products and those operations now go on their books. So they have a vested interest in those companies they invest in, or who they buy their resources from, who they use, who they do business with. They have an interest in seeing those emissions go down because they impact their net zero goal. And so again, you know, one way to think about it is one company's scope 3 is going to be another company's scope 1 potentially. So it's connected. And as you see these big investor, you know, institutional investors setting net zero goals, you see banks setting net zero goals, you think through things like, you know, loans, mortgages, you know, financing or arranging debt offerings. All of these now, they start to connect, and you can't just sort of silo things off. So there's a big push from, as these goals happen, they have ripple effects, right, that make it relevant for, you know, for small and medium-sized businesses. Next slide, please. Just quickly on TCFD, you know, there's real momentum behind TCFD being adopted as the global standard for corporate climate disclosure. We've already got official reporting requirements in a number of companies. Again, there's more than 2,600 organizations, primarily businesses, although it includes a number of governments in there, supporting TCFD. And that momentum is just continuing to grow. On the next slide. It's relevant in particular in Canada. So this past week, there was quite a significant step. The Canadian Securities Administrators, which is sort of the umbrella organization for the different securities commissions across the country, issued draft regulations for mandatory climate disclosure. So companies publicly traded would be required to publish climate-related disclosures in alignment with TCFD. You know, the timing of those likely wouldn't apply until fiscal year 2023. But when you start thinking about the work that needs to go into that and how you prepare for it, that's, you know, that the clock is ticking. We already see this, you know, this is in effect in the UK. Andrew mentioned how, you know, the SEC in the US is looking closely at this. So momentum is building. This is not if, but when. And this week, there's, again, a real step forward that, you know, this is coming to Canada. This is going to be real here. So it needs to be something that businesses need to be prepared for. Next slide. So just quickly on some things to think about as you're, you know, taking the steps around TCFD and thinking about how to do it, or even if you are already doing it. Next slide. One of the things we really always try to emphasize is the focus on, you know, measuring what matters. What consistently happens is organizations get fixated on greenhouse gas emissions, and they think about GHG metrics and targets as the key thing. But that's only one. That's one piece of the puzzle, and it's really not the place to start. Governance, strategy, and risk management are really critical pieces on climate disclosure. And before you set your targets and look at your metrics, you need to be thinking about, well, what are the things that are actually the most relevant for me and my business? You know, because different businesses are exposed to different climate risks and opportunities in different ways. Next slide. So when you're thinking about where to start, the key pieces that we really stress when we work with clients to help them on TCFD is, one is, you need to start by just understanding what are the climate-related risks and opportunities that face your business. And again, the TCFD gives you a framework to ask those questions and dig into it. You don't want to just jump straight to setting a target on something, because the target may not be particularly relevant depending on how your business is structured and how climate impacts it. It's once you've understood what those risks and opportunities are, that's when you start to then lay out, okay, what are climate ambitions and what is our strategy to get there? Next slide. So just to wrap up, the key takeaways on this are really, again, TCFD is about integrating climate across your whole organization. It's not just a sustainability thing, it's a business issue. It's when thinking about best practices, they're going to continue to change. There's new guidance coming out, the TCFD updates its directives and guidance for reporting. So again, this is not static. It's going to evolve. New tools are going to come out. Different best practices will emerge. So again, to close with this is really thinking about it as a journey. It's not a one-off. It's not just we're going to check the box and then we're done. It's going to be an ongoing process to really help make sure that our business is set up to thrive as we shift to a low carbon world. So I'll wrap it up there, and looking forward to questions.
Getting tangled up here. Thank you so much, Kevin. Andrew, if you want to throw your camera back on here too. Okay, awesome. We had an incredible amount of information across both of you, both of your presentations there, and I'm seeing some actually really rich questions coming in the chat here, so I'm excited about this. I'm not gonna steal any questions here. I'm just gonna go right to one which I think will set us up quite nicely, which was a question around science-based targets. And I think one of the currents of discussion that I hear in a lot of these environments is around folks initially using, and I think this was directed particularly to very, very large corporates, using TCFD and other aligned reporting frameworks as a kind of choose your own adventure, to say, oh yeah, well, we care about climate change, we're concerned about it, and here's the world we think is going to happen, and we're going to choose that on the basis of probably the world we want the most, maybe not what's most likely, and we're going to report against that as the basis. And I'm playing very fast and loose here, but of course the brilliance of the Science-Based Targets Initiative is that you can't do that. You have to ground what it is you're trying to do in the science. And Kevin and Andrew, we've seen some interesting work coming out of TCFD over the past few weeks, even on sort of grounding their metrics work in more of the science, and trying to be clear on what kind of scenarios are going to be allowed and what ones might not be. So I'd just like to, the question simply is to both of you, can you talk a little bit about the financial risks of a company not using a science-based target, of avoiding some sort of engagement with the science? Maybe they're reporting on climate risk, but they're doing it in a very qualitative way, and they're avoiding any of those questions of, well, what does our business model look like in a world where the carbon price is $150 a ton everywhere? If they're avoiding those questions, what are the risks that they're bringing onto themselves? And maybe Kevin, if you want to kick that one off.
Yeah, I assume we got about 4 hours, and Andrew and I can go deep on this. I know there's a lot there to unpack, so I'll try and keep it short. I would say at a high level, the big risk in all of this, and the case we have to make to companies who are like, well, maybe not yet, we don't need to do it yet, or what have you, is you either tell your climate story or someone else is going to tell it for you. And so that's, certainly from the publicly traded standpoint, that's a real risk if you don't go this route. And so if you're not doing, setting targets and putting forward a strategy that is aligned with the science, then that's probably going to start getting picked apart pretty quick. So that's a key piece. And for those who aren't as familiar with the science-based targets approach, the key piece is really thinking about what are the interim targets. So how much do you need to reduce your emissions by 2025, 2030, 2035? Because if everyone's setting net zero by 2050, then that target is set. That's not the issue. The issue is, well, what do we have to do to get there? Because what you see oftentimes, and the scrutiny is growing, is that companies will kind of say, oh yeah, we'll do net zero by 2050, but their CapEx and their financial reporting sure looks like that's more a case of, we're going to keep doing what we're doing until 2049, and hopefully at the buzzer something will break through, right? And that's just not credible. So maybe I'll just pause it there, because I'd like to hear what Andrew's thoughts on that too.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more in terms of controlling your own narrative. Certainly, the investor community will fill in that gap and fill in that void and make assumptions for themselves. Likewise, the buying community for the supply chain members that we work with, also will fill in that narrative void. Um, More and more supply chain members and more large purchasing organizations that are setting science-based targets also have to have a scope 3 component of that science-based target because their environmental impact is largely in their supply chain. And the supply chain aspect of a science-based target generally means that those vendors have to start looking at science-based targets themselves. And so the buying organizations are really ratcheting up their expectations of the strategic vendors. A great example is Microsoft, for instance, which embedded in their supplier code of conduct the expectation that all vendors who work with Microsoft understand and disclose scopes 1, 2, and 3, and have a target that is in line with Microsoft's carbon negative ambition. So the financial risk of not doing anything, it could be pretty substantial. I think different companies, right, weigh it out, but I would also really echo Kevin's point where the interim targets are critically important. You can't just set a 2050 or 2030 goal and hope it works out. You really need to lay the groundwork now and have that step-by-step, very structured approach to get there before you sort of have to, either by regulation or by buyer default.
Great points, both of you. I think just one, I'll use my moderator privilege here just to quickly say that from the government side as well, right? We have City of Vancouver, 50% reduction target by 2030, and we will have certainly a midpoint check-in in 2025 for our climate emergency action plan. The granularity of the regulations we're setting will, for many businesses, it's going to impact you on that short order. So if you're loftily planning for 2050 or not planning for 2050, guess what? You may bump into some barriers much sooner than you expect, particularly in your local context. So I think it's really worth highlighting that the need for specificity and to address these things sooner rather than later is going to come from multiple sides. And you folks are speaking supply chain, but certainly from local governments across the country and around the world, there's tons and tons to be relevant there. And we're going to circle back to that towards the end. We've got a question here more specific. So, but it ties really nicely into this question of scope 3. Which I think both of you raised in an interesting way. So the question reads, our company produces alternate fuel vehicles which reduce greenhouse gas emissions emitted in transportation. Our products, greenhouse gas profile would be our scope 3 and our customers' scope 1. As we disclose this, how could we ensure we aren't double counting emissions or any of the potential offset credits or otherwise that they might look to accrue with that? Is there a resource that can help with guidance on this? I'm going to cheat a little bit and say that Vancouver Economic Commission is actually releasing a report on carbon offsetting that's going to come out in a week or two, which will actually very rigorously, we're really excited about, it's going to go through some of the, if you're looking specifically at carbon offsetting, have some guidance around that. But I think this question was really about disclosure. And so, how are we understanding where their products' greenhouse gas emissions should be counted? I'll just read that again. Our product's greenhouse gas profile would be our scope 3 and our customers' scope 1, i.e. the emissions the vehicle emits. As we disclose this, how do we ensure we aren't double counting?
I would say you will get into the weeds very quickly trying to evaluate what your scope 1 is versus your scope 3 when you're talking about product development. The GHG protocol is a fantastic resource that will really articulate the boundaries of what to include in your greenhouse gas footprint. So I certainly would point you to that standard that is freely available and a wealth of knowledge. I think when you're building a product, to understand what is in your operational control and what is your indirect emissions might be piece by piece in some cases, and you might have to break it down on an LCA basis if you really want to get granular to understand where that embedded carbon is in the things that you create and then transport or deliver to buyers. So the GHG protocol really explains it thoroughly. The organizations that draft it, update it regularly. So I certainly would point you to that resource.
Yeah, just to quickly add on that, I certainly agree with all that. There's lots of good resources out there, and very quickly it can get complicated. But again, there are resources and lots of groups out there that can help. I would just say at a high level, the thing that I really try to stress to keep in mind in all this is, again, it's easy to get really fixated on the emissions piece, but that is just the tip of the iceberg. So the way I would sort of put it is, you could have two companies today with the exact same GHG emissions profile for scope 1, 2, and 3. But one company has, climate embedded into their board risk committee. They have some chief climate officer. They have a strategy to align their capex to renewables. They're divesting carbon intensive assets, et cetera. The other company doesn't. The other company is just either they're not disclosing anything, or they're just sort of stay the course. Just looking at the emissions doesn't tell you the story about those companies, because it's just inherently backwards looking. So the emissions piece is important, but looking at the components of governance, risk management, and strategy are really critical for getting on top of these issues, because they ultimately answer the question of, well, so what? So whatever your scope 3 emissions are, then the question is, so what? What are you going to do about it? Is it a risk? If it's not, why not? And thinking those pieces through. So I just always try to stress that. Again, it's easy to go straight to the emissions, and it's critical for sure to have those, but it's not, it's not the be all end all.
And thank you for referencing those resources again. We're almost at time here, so I'm just going to try to do two ones here quickly. So the first one, I'm just going to say both of them, and I'll ask you both to just respond to them. The first one is around privately held companies. So if there's public pressure, maybe not even for your board, could be unclear. What's the rationale?
George froze a little bit for me.
Same here, but I think the question is, what's the rationale to disclose if you're a privately held company?
I think we can go for it.
Go for it, Andrew. I'm serving it up to you. You go first.
Sure. So the supply chain program, we certainly work with a lot of privately held companies, and that's where the leverage from the buyers really come into play. And so for a company, a large company like Walmart, for instance, that has thousands upon thousands of suppliers, Walmart itself has a really ambitious environmental goal. And so it is both a carrot and stick approach that they engage the private and smaller vendors that they source from. So the carrot approach is, we have this goal, we would like to support you, we would like you to come along with us, we would like to celebrate you. The stick approach is, we are embedding this in our operations, and to Kevin's point, it is part of our governance structure. And so if you don't align with this, we will find suppliers that are more resilient, or are doing this, or are looking forward to understand how climate risk may or may not impact their organization. So the investor lever is really, really strong, but that's only one part of the equation. The buying relationship that companies have with B2B companies, or even B2C, if we want to get consumers involved in this, it is that financial, the financial, levers that are at play with that side of the equation as well.
Yeah, and just to quickly add on that, I mean, to put it in sort of blunt terms, in the Canadian context anyways, for those who are on, 5 biggest banks in Canada have all committed to net zero. And also on top of that, Van City Credit Union is committed to net zero by 2040. And all of those banks have committed to PCAF, which is the Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials. So accounting for the scope 1, 2, and 3. So if your business, if you're privately held, if you're banking with any of them, if you're getting loans from them, if they're helping to finance things for you, your actions are relevant to their goals. So that's why it's going to be important disclosure, because they're going to be coming to you to ask for that info. It may not be tomorrow, but it's inevitable. It is going to happen, because they need that information to meet their targets.
Brilliant. I think that puts it so starkly, Kevin. I love that that reminder that yeah, even if you're you're in the context of just doing small business loans with ABC Bank, guess what? They're going to be knocking on your door sooner rather than later. And apologies for cutting out there. It sounds like you both heard both the questions. I guess we're going to close here in 30 seconds. I'm going to hand this back to Karen. But before we do that, I just want to say thank you both so much for your time here. This has been really engaging. And Kevin and Andrew, I know you both said at various points, how much time do we have? Can we keep going? We can. I think this will be the first of many conversations. So Karen, I think I'll turn it back over to you and just express my gratitude to the Pembina Institute, wonderful partners in putting all this together. They've done a tremendous amount of work, Catalyst Business Coalition, to make this really sing, and just really grateful to collaborate with them.
Thank you. And yes, I'd like to also echo. Yeah, we caught the tail end there and the gist of what you're saying. I'd also like to echo thanks to Kevin and Andrew for sharing your insights. I certainly learned a lot, and I believe the participants did as well. Huge shout out to George for moderating this conversation and injecting his insights and knowledge. And also I'd like to give a shout out to the Pembina team, Nadine Abudalaway, Melissa Hudson, and Sam Ward for supporting to produce this webinar series. Thanks to all of you for spending the hour with us. And as a reminder, the webinar and the presentations will be posted on the Pembina website. And if you're interested to learn more about Catalyst Business Alliance or the Pembina Institute, please check out our websites. Enjoy the rest of your day.